Very orange today. Okay, so what we're talking about in these reflections on relief is non-duality. Duality being a two-ness, a subject and an object. Yeah, the me, subject, taken to be subject, viewing object. Let's say wall. Subject, object is two. So non-duality is negating that two-ness, predominantly by looking at the subject. And it's so important, at least in my life, this idea when looking at depression. Because I've seen friends and family members of friends, depression is destroying their lives, and it destroyed a lot of my life. And every time I see that somebody has killed themselves, or somebody has tried to kill themselves, or harm others and themselves because of this depression that has taken over the system, yeah, it just kind of like turns my heart a little bit, because humbly I believe that there is a solution for the most part, at least in my experience, from my experience. And the solution is to see that you are not the movements of the mental process, because it is a mental process that's happening. There's a thought process which is suggesting that you are the thinker. That's the duality. There's a thought which is suggesting subject thinker, object thought. And non-duality is looking into the thinker. Is that a true suggestion as to what you are? Are you initiating those thoughts? Now, if your depression, if you've experienced lows like I've experienced, I highly, highly doubt that you are willfully initiating that movement of mental process, because it creates such a dark hell. There's no way that you are willfully initiating that thought process, which means that thought process, that mental movement, which I'm going to call depression here, something is happening which initiates that which you are not doing. And you are not doing it because you are not the mental process of the depression. If I'm living as the mental process, and that mental process's habit is oriented toward depression, I'm going to take myself to be depressed. And from that standpoint of a perspective of how I'm living life, I'm going to want to get out of that depression. And I know this also from my own experience, that suicide becomes a very viable option in that. Why is suicide an option when depression gets super, super dark? Because the thinking suggests that there's a thinker. Now, the thinking has to have some literally body to be in, to suggest the thinker as a what? As a body. As a body. So if I'm taking myself to be the mental process which is depressed, that mental process is also suggesting that I'm the thinker of the depressive thoughts. I'm the originator of the depressive thoughts who is in this body. So how am I going to end the depressive thoughts? By ending the body. So that's why suicide becomes this very viable option. The whole thing being rooted in the identification that the thoughts, the mental process is mine. I'm doing that. There's a J which is initiating the mental process. There's a J which is experiencing the mental process. Now, obviously, there's a mental process happening. There's a depressive, there's something in the head, a mental system, yes? But that mental system is a program. You are not initiating that mental system. For some reason, there's a program. Maybe something happened in childhood. Yes? So for me, I feel like that's what has taken place. There was things set in motion early on in this body's life, this character's life, that we would call J. that I would call J, yeah, that set a habitual pattern of shame, of shame's a good word to use, of shame, of loneliness, of being different, yeah, of always being the one who initiates negativity for others, always being the one who fails. Yes, so there's a habitual pattern set up there, a mental process. Now, I'm not doing that mental process. It's been produced through whatever has happened in that mental process's life, yes? It's like you have to see that it's a mechanism that you're not initiating. Yeah, therefore, the depression that comes from the symptom of that mechanism, from that operation, is not yours. Yes? Because when I live from the perspective that I am the mental system, and if that mental system is depressed, then I'm taking myself to be depressed. And then I'm going to want out of that mental system, obviously, because it's wildly uncomfortable. So there's going to be a wanting to get away from the mental system. And suicide becomes a very viable option because the mental system is also saying that I am this body. I might seem like I get a little fired up because I kind of do, because there's a solution to this shit, I feel. And the first step of that solution is to see that you are not the mental process, which is initiating the depression. So if there's a setup, something has happened in my life, and there's a habit pattern of looking at myself negatively, which is going to cause a depression, let's say. Then later in life, let's say I'm 25, yes, and I fail at something. I don't do something right. Let's say a relationship. I don't act right in the relationship, so the relationship ends. Now that same mental process is going to fire as a reaction to the happening. I'm just talking in my own experience. Now that mental process is going to fire pretty heavy because the habit pattern is directed towards shame. I'm the problem. I'm the one who did it. Yeah. That mental process is going to start spinning. Now, if I'm taking myself to be the mental process that's spinning, I'm listening to it and believing it, which means I'm putting air into the fire. Yeah, because the mental process and thoughts really have no power until what's listening to them gives them power. What you are, what I am, is open listening awareness. Yeah, before the mental process. The mental process is just firing. Thoughts are just going all the time. They have no power until I listen to them. Until I buy that what they are, what is talking in my head is me. Now they have a lot of power. They have so much power that I think I'm them. Now the game really changes with the thought system, the mental production, if I'm taking it to be me, because now the mental production has me. Yeah. Now the thought pattern, now the depression is having me. I'm not having depression anymore. If you've experienced depression like me, does it not feel like something is running you that you're not doing? Because I can tell you from my experience, that's exactly what that shit feels like. It's exactly like there's something running me which I'm not running, which used to get so crazy that sometimes I would break out in like hysterical laughter because it was so insane. It's like if you took Cirque du Soleil and compacted it and threw it inside the head, it was like that. And wasn't willfully doing any of that. I feel like depression in a way is like alcoholism, where it's like kind of taken over the system. But because it's taken over the thought system is talking to you as you. So then you buy into the thought system, the mental system, and you take that system to be you. And then if that system is prone to depression, you're going to feel that you're really depressed, and then that you're feeding that system. It's important to see that you're not doing the head. You're not doing it. It's operating on its own. Yeah, it's like a mechanism that's operating. It's a programmed mechanism that's going. You're not initiating that mechanism. You're the one that's aware of the mechanism. And I feel like this is the part that really isn't spoken about a lot, because it comes from like advaita, yeah, I'm not that, or it comes from like early Zen. What is perceived is not perceiving. Yeah. You know you're not the thought system because you can see the thought system operating the same way that I can see the wall or I can see the laptop. Yes? Which means from the perspective of the eyes and the brain, I'm not the laptop. So if we take that as like a gross example and we make it a little more subtle, you can see the thought process happening. It's just that there's a habit pattern, yeah, to identify as that thought process. For many of us, simply because we've never heard the message of non-duality. You've never studied Zen or Chan or, Advaita. You're not the body and mind. You have a body and mind, but you're not the body and mind. With depression, I found that pattern is really strong. It's almost like, in a way, you can negate the other thought patterns. Yeah, you can be like, oh, I can see that moving. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. But then there's specific thought patterns, and in my experience, depressive thought patterns and thought patterns that lead to depression, yeah, they seem super believable. They seem like, no, that one is true. I am that piece of junk. I am the one who constantly fails. Yeah, I am that one. But even those deep set patterns are still not you. You're not initiating those deep set patterns. If you look back to your if you have like deep depression or anxiety, yeah, if you look back to your last, what I used to call crash, like a downturn in the mental life. If you look back to your last one and you go right to the front end of that, I had a therapist years ago who used to tell me to do this. I go right to the front end, right before that pattern started, before that downfall started, yeah. And then I went another 2 hours in front of that. And then you play that time out, you'll start to see what happens. You'll start to see that you were walking through a day fine, and then maybe a thought happened, you saw something, somebody said something to you, and it initiated a mental process, an old mental process that was not happening. Literally was not happening. Yeah, it initiates an old ass mental process. And then the story that comes with that mental process, which has been told in your head a million times, is now playing out again. And does it not always feel like the exact same depression? Very rarely did I run into a new depression. Oh, this is a new version. No, it was the same story and it was the same feeling over and over again. Yeah. It's an old process that's coming up right now. So it's vital to see that we're not the mental process. We're not the mental process. There's a communication with the environment through the senses. Then the head is defining that mental process, that life, let's say. It's defining life minute to minute. You are not initiating that. If you heard the sound of a bird right now, yes, if that sound came up to you, you would not have to effort the mind to go bird. The mind is doing it, mental process. It's the same thing in my experience with this depression. And the first step is to see that you're not it. You're not it. And if you've had depression like I've had depression, it's not going to be a far reach to see that you're not it. Yeah, because the depression is so dark, there's no way you're doing that to yourself. There's no way. It's a mechanism. So what happens when you see you're not it? You learn to stop listening to it, essentially. You get really bored of that old story. Because now when you're walking through your life and there's something that happens, yes, if a depression or if an old thought system comes after that, it's a translation of what's happening now using source material from what happened way before. So you're actually not even perceiving what's happening right there. It's almost like my depression is always old depression. It's always a past story. It's never what's happening right now. There's a happening right now in the world, in your life. And then there's a translation of that through that mental process. Now, if the translator is habituated to be, oh, I failed, I'm this, yeah, I'm never going to be good enough, I'm always the worst one, I don't fit in. If that's the translation in the head, that's what the head is doing, yeah? If I'm taking myself to be that mental process, I'm in for a good drop. So we have to see that we're not that mental process, which will come along with seeing that we're not the body. You have a body and mind, but you are not the body and the mind. You are not the body and the mind. So then what happens to the mental process? In my experience, the mental process still fires. But the life, now it's a lot shorter. But when I started hearing this message, the mental process would come up, sometimes get caught in it, sometimes see it, and it waves off. Because I'm not feeding it. Remember, the mental thoughts don't have power. You're giving the thoughts the power. You are faith and power. You are faith and power. And wherever you put that faith and power is how your life is going to go. So there's simply a habit pattern of putting that faith and power into the mental system. And if the mental system is up to self-doubt, and the mental system is up to depression, and the mental system is up to you're going to think you are that. And then you're going to want out of that. And then for some of us who have really bad depression, suicide is a good option. It's not a good option, but seemingly it seems that way. And then from the standpoint of you not being that mental process, the whole thing will chill out over time because you stop giving it its power. Now, will the mental process still exist? Yeah, probably. You see, Advaita is not actually too worried about the contents of the experience, the mental process. We're just looking at to whom does it arise? Is there a J who is initiating, is the thinker? There is not. There is no central self which is initiating this. There's just a bunch of happening. There's a bunch of movement, yeah, which we take ourselves to be the movement. And that is what a J would be considered, a self. That is a misunderstanding. That's a misidentification. Yes? There is no self. There's no hub in the wheel. There's a bunch of happening going on. So when we disentangle from the thought patterns in my experience still exist. Now this is the thing. As knowing, as a deep knowing from your beingness, from awareness that you're not the thought pattern, now you can be honest about what's going on in the head. Because from the head, you're not going to be able to be honest about what's going on in the head. Because you're taking yourself to be that system. Self cannot get out of self. That's a saying from Alcoholics Anonymous, Recovery 12-step programs. Self cannot get out of self. If I am taking myself to be the thought pattern, the mental process, which is growing depression, if I'm taking myself to be that, I'm not going to be able to get out of that depression as that mental system. I can't do it, which is another reason I feel like suicide becomes a real option, because people try to get out of the mental system as the mental system. You try to get out of depression as the one who's depressed, and you can't do it because the head can't do it. The mental system can't do it. So it gets more uncomfortable, it gets more claustrophobic, and the level of depression gets heavier and heavier because self can't get out of self. It can't happen. So we have to be able to step out of it somehow. And the understanding is that you're not it. In absolute terms, you were never in depression in the first place. There's a mental process happening that depression is coming out of. Again, I'm just speaking in my experience. Mental process, depression is coming out of that mental process. You were never in it. From day one, you were never in it. You're not initiating it. You were never in that mental process. It's the seeming like there's a J who this is happening to. Then the J wants to get out of the J, but the J, the head, is not going to be able to get out of the head. The system can't figure out the system, whatever Einstein said. So how do we do it? We see that we're not it. You see that you're not the head. Then you can be honest about the contents. You can be really truthfully honest because you're not it. Yeah, the head is not going to be honest about what's going on in the head. It's just not going to happen. I've never been able to do that. The honesty comes from seeing that you're not it. That what the mental process is something that is foreign, or is something that is just that you're not that mental process. That it's an operation happening based on past things. That's really, for me, what's like saved my life a lot of times. And I feel like it is the solution to that. And then, as not being that mental process, you can be honest about it and you can really start to work on it. But until that point, the head is just going to try to be figuring itself out, which means it's not going to look at itself. The head is not going to want to be figured out. The mental process is because it wants control. The problem being that we are living as the problem. Oh man. We are existing as the problem. You see? If there's a thought pattern happening and I'm taking myself to be that thought pattern, I am living as the problem. So we have to see it, that we're not the mental process. That we are power, that we are the listening, we are the awareness. Yeah, it comes from seeing what you're not. The perceiver cannot be the perceived. That's a really good one from Wang Po. Come in, Claire. The perceiver cannot be the perceived. If you're seeing the mental process and you're observing the depression, then that is not who the perceiver is. That is part of the contents of what's being perceived. The perceiver is not the perceived. So then you can start to look at what's being perceived honestly. And you don't have to believe me, just look into it. Look at it. Yeah, investigate, inquire into that. Because it's what's given me the most relief. And over time it gets stronger, it progresses. Yeah. And the more you disentangle from it, you see you're not the mental process. If you're going to therapy or you're doing embodiment stuff or whatever you're doing, yeah, it becomes 10 times more powerful because you can be wildly honest about what's going on in the head because you know you're not it. You know you're not it. Yeah. It's like when you're talking to a friend The friend is telling you their problems and you have all these amazing answers. Yeah. Because you're not taking them to be your problems. But then when you have problems, all those answers seem to elude you all of a sudden. Yeah. So if you're taking yourself to be the head isn't going to have a lot of answers because the head isn't, the mental process doesn't want to look at its own part to play. But when you see it as other than you, now you can be honest about it, and now you can get you can make a lot of progress on that depressive pattern, or whatever you're seemingly struggling with. That's where that relief comes from, the release, the freedom. I just humbly really believe that to be true. And I'm tired of seeing people kill themselves and relapse and destroy relationships and have things go. Yeah. They're not doing that. It's the mental process that's doing it. But we're listening, we put so much faith in the head, despite the fact that the head is what's killing us. We still put faith in it because it seems there's no other option. Well, what else am I going to do? I am the thought pattern. You're not the mental process. You're not. Yeah, you are much greater, more subtle, and much greater. The awareness.